Okay, good afternoon everybody. My name's Hugh Lester and I work for the WJEC in Cardiff. We're delighted to be sponsoring the conference again this year, and we're particularly delighted to be able to introduce James Ball to this afternoon's session. James has worked in political investigative journalism in the US and UK for BuzzFeed, The Guardian and The Washington Post. His reporting has won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, the British Journalism Award for Investigative Reporting and the Lawrence Stern Fellowship, among others. His most recent book, and the focus of this session, is the highly acclaimed Post-Truth, How Bullshit Conquered the World. It's a highly topical account of the slow rise of a political, media and online infrastructure that has devalued truth. So I'm sure you want to join me in giving a warm Nate welcome to James. Okay, so for the next couple of hours, first of all with James and then with the panel afterwards, we're going to be talking about bullshit. To start off, James, could you explain for us what this bullshit is?
Well, I mean, I could be facetious and just say, you know it when you smell it. But I went for bullshit over fake news or lies or all of this stuff really deliberately. And it comes back to an essay by a Princeton philosopher, which was just called On Bullshit. And it's quite an interesting thing when you read it, especially when you realize it was written more than a decade ago, because he starts talking about essentially truth versus lies versus bullshit. And he says the liar is almost sort of respecting truth. They're not telling it, but a liar will try and be consistent. They'll use the same tricks as truth. They'll tell the same story each time. They'll try and make it logical and consistent with the rest of the facts. And so they're almost kind of nodding with a little bit of respect to the system, even as they disrupt it. The bullshitter, on the other hand, just totally ignores the system and the merit and all of it entirely. They will tell whichever story works for them in that moment with that audience. And it won't matter if it directly contradicts what they said yesterday, and they won't care if they directly contradict it again tomorrow. And what he argued, and what I've sort of extended, is this idea that actually what happens if you have bullshitters in big positions of power? And essentially, a bullshitter doesn't respect institution. All you are to a bullshitter, you're not sort of the fourth estate, you're not a court, you're not anything like that, you're a rival narrative. And so anyone else who's telling a story is an opponent. You know, they're either boosting your story or they're opposing it. They're not checking it, they're not guiding it. And so the thing that damages our institutions and the idea of truth is a bullshitter. And you may be able to think of some examples from modern politics. I mean, you know, that might be niche, but...
Are you able to give us some examples? You're amongst friends.
So, well,
and it's not being recorded or anything.
Yeah, you know, it's not like we're on mic. Well, you know, you've got to look at the occupant of the Oval Office and just say it is the archetype of exactly this model of it. You know, he will attack a court, he will attack a judge, he will attack the media, and it's anyone who would challenge his story. And it's not a totally cynical strategy. You can sort of see there's belief in it. There's all sorts of ridiculous and pointless bits of bullshit that come out of Trump and the White House, you know, things that are just absolutely patently false, and there's video evidence. You know, he'll sort of say he had the biggest inauguration crowd ever. There's not really any shame in him not having that. You know, he was a Republican victor. His base was on the other side of the country. You're not going to get as many people traveling as when a Democrat wins, with New York just up the road, DC, the most liberal town in America there. Democrats get bigger inauguration crowds just because of geography. So something that wasn't embarrassing that he didn't need to lie about, lies about. That same day, though, he went in front of the CIA, and he was sitting in front of the wall of stars, which represent agents who died in the line. And to them, on camera, told them that he'd never criticized the deep state or the intelligence agencies. And that's an audience of professionals whose whole job is sifting out information from misinformation from lies. There was no chance they would ever believe him. But in front of that audience, he wanted to tell them what they wanted to hear. And that's what he does again and again. Nearer to home, if you're looking for an obvious other, I mean, I often say the story of bullshit really is the story of two blondes and one bus. So you've got Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, and 350 million a week. So I would say you could start looking there.
Yeah. Why do we fall for it?
Yeah.
And if we do, why do we fall for it?
Essentially, I think we often talk about misinformation. We often talk about polarization as if it's about fake news. And it's not. The most dangerous stuff is where you've got a little nugget of truth in the middle. And, you know, I tend to think about social media. You know, I used to work at BuzzFeed. I'm an internet journalist. I like my memes. But it's this thing of, we all know what you do when you're on Facebook or when you're on Twitter. The stuff that you share isn't, this was a really good and measured, lengthy analysis of something. You go, it's the thing where you look at that and go, I can't believe those bastards have done this. This is outrageous. You know, in that first, you almost get a kick of adrenaline of, I can't believe this is happening. You know, whether you're, and this hits you whether you're on the left of politics or on the right. I think we all tend to think fake news is the other side's problem, or misinformation is. No, I'm meant to be an expert on this, and I managed to share a fake story probably about once a week. I do delete them when I spot them, I promise. But sort of the example of this stuff and sort of the way it works would be, I would take the example of a story from Breitbart. And essentially, they reported Muslim mob sets fire to Germany's oldest church. And I would say that's a deliberately inflammatory headline. It's trying to stoke hate. It's, you know, an awful piece of work in my thing. But is it fake news? So what happened was there was a protest of refugees. And of course, Germany's taken in almost 500,000 refugees. And when you try and house a lot of people at short notice, conditions are poor. And a lot of the people were protesting that. You know, I've used protest, they've used mob. Is that a matter of fact or opinion? It's probably the latter. Now, most of these refugees are from Syria, which is a majority Muslim country. So most of them are Muslim. Now, part of this protest, people were setting off firecrackers. One of those firecrackers hit a tarpaulin on a boundary wall of a church, you know, like around the yard and the graveyard, and started a small fire of a tarpaulin, which people in the crowd ran over to help stamp out. So here's the sort of tricky thing that we get to. You don't have a sort of fake story. They haven't concocted it to spread hate. But, you know, was there a crowd? Was it predominantly Muslim? Was there a fire? Was it a church? Yes, to all of them. Was it still a dangerous and polarizing and dishonest story? Yes. And so I think we have this issue where what works is stuff that inflames our emotions, that sort of sets us going. The ultimate example in the British context would be, as a rough test, how many people here read a story that Tories have voted that animals can't feel pain? Yeah, it went everywhere. About 4 million people read a story saying, you know, they voted animals can't feel pain. It was actually to do with a minor procedural thing relating to recognizing sentience rather than pain. It wasn't actually any reform of existing law. It kind of just wasn't an issue. And it ended up becoming such a big thing that the government had to vow to bring in legislation sort of acknowledging that animals feel pain. You know, we're a country with pretty good animal welfare laws already, but that's a very good example of a kind of bullshit version of the story working. People were already ready to believe the worst of this government, lots of people, and people like animals. So if you hit two different emotional triggers, that's what we share. And the internet's been very interesting on one level because we all know what to say we want from our media. You know, we want more facts and less bias. Much less of that celebrity news. You know, I don't want that nonsense. More foreign reporting. Oh yeah, foreign reporting's good. And then and then we get to see the actual traffic of what you all actually read, and it ain't the foreign news, guys. And so any tabloid editor who takes a bet on what people say they want is going to lose a lot of sales. And there's nothing wrong with that. We can have news and celeb news and cooking. All of that's fine. But what we really click and what we really want is stuff that is very, very susceptible to the tactics of a bullshitter. Yeah. That was a very long answer, sorry.
No, it's good. But you write quite a lot in your book about clickbait and that kind of thing and how that works. And you see clickbait across the whole spectrum now, don't you? I mean, The Guardian indulges in it as well as other newspapers. And
I mean, The Guardian, who I still write for as a freelance client, a wonderful newspaper.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean, the Guardian version of clickbait is usually why good thing is actually bad.
Yeah.
You know, if you want to tap into Guardian audience sharing, why quinoa is destroying the planet. Perfect. I'm not joking, that's a real article. And it did lead the site for ages. So, Daily Mail actually once got huge numbers on a story called "Did Trump Secret Service Agent Wear False Hands to Hide Gun During Inauguration?" You may be surprised to know the answer was no. And so it's a slight peril of the online ecosystem. I actually think this is one of the few things that has got better in the year this book has been out. More and more people are actually starting to pay a little bit for news again. Not as much as they used to, but that's fine. It's cheaper to deliver a web page to you than it is to deliver a printed magazine, so you should get it cheaper too. But the danger before was when you visit a web page, that's worth about 0.5 cent, maybe a little bit less, to the place reading it. Now that's then got to pay for not only the sort of cost of the infrastructure, the bandwidth, all of that, it's got to pay for the reporter, the sub-editor, all of that kind of stuff. And so if you are in a model where you need hundreds of thousands of people to read each story for it just to break even, do you do the sort of careful, thoroughly reported, well-researched, nuanced version of it, or do you do the one that everyone's got to go, Theresa May wants to ban cats, or... And we had, when I was at BuzzFeed, the political editor there spotted quite an interesting proposal in the Tory manifesto of Theresa May saying she wanted to work with other countries to try and build a new version of the internet that had sort of security and privacy stuff built in. Mad proposal, it was never going to go anywhere. But he wrote that up, decent little exclusive, got about 30,000, 40,000 people looking at it. It's okay. Another publication took that, ripped off his work, but put the headline on it, Theresa May wants to shut down the internet. And that was one of the 10 most read stories of the election campaign. And so the danger of it is it sort of turns it into this pile them high, sell them cheap kind of thing. And if you're looking to cut your costs and boost your traffic, you actually realize, hang on, that's fake news. If you just invent the story, you make it even cheaper to do, and you can make it more outrageous. And so you've got this odd thing where lots of newspapers talk about fake news as if it's this unique phenomenon. It's like, actually, it's just the same business model as we're all in, but thankfully shifting from a bit.
Yeah. Thank you. As you know, post-truth was the Oxford English Dictionary's word of the year in 2016. However, in your book, you point out that some of what you write about have been going on for a long, long time. It's not a new thing for newspapers or politicians on occasion to spin things in a certain way, or even on occasion to be economical with the truth. So,
Gasp.
Yeah, I'm shocked too. So why do you think the concept of post-truth has become so much more of an issue recently? Is it just to do with the internet?
I think partly, I mean, I should say I'm a fan of the internet, and I'm not quite as bleak as the title of my book would suggest. It's just a Yorkshire habit, really. But I think there is no bigger filter bubble than living, say, in a village, largely with people of your class and your race, and buying a newspaper a day, which is probably the same one that the people around you do. You know, you are in the ultimate filter bubble there. And part of what's happened online is that we get to see other people's bubbles, and that we're not as comfortable and agreeing with each other as we used to think we were. You know, we read more news from more sources. You know, we're better informed, we're more literate, really, than we've ever been. The bleak side of that is, God, is this really as good as it's got? But I think we have the issue of the internet weaponizes and accelerates the spread of this kind of misinformation, especially when you start to get to quite dangerous conspiracy theories. I think one particularly grim one was in the days immediately after Grenfell Tower. And of course, there was rightly this huge anger in the streets, and there was a real mood around Kensington and Chelsea. And you could see people were worried where it could go. And places put out the idea that there are actually going to be hundreds of victims, and the authorities were covering it up. And at one point, a sort of quite far left-wing blog did a post very strongly suggesting there was a D notice on banning the media from giving the truth about the death toll, which immediately started going everywhere. Now, I happen to know about D notices. They're actually called DSMA notices now, and they're this voluntary code that asks the media not to report certain details of stories for national security reasons. They're completely voluntary. I worked on the Guardian Snowden stuff. They put one out asking everyone not to report on those, to which we said, actually, no, and carried on doing it. So I've broken a D notice before. You don't quite get disappeared yet. But it's not some opaque, weird system. They have a website, and you can phone them up. And so, you know, being the crack investigative journalist that I am, I was set out to say, you know, is there any truth at all to this D notice thing? So I phoned the number on the website, and there's an admiral and a brigadier that run the committee. And I got the brigadier. And said, you know, do you have a D notice out covering Grenfell? We said, of course not, that would be ludicrous. It's really hard journalism. And he said, not only do we not have one, he said we couldn't do one. He says they're about national security. I could give you an example of one. There was sort of, after the Manchester bombings, there were some special forces explosive experts with police when they were doing the raids. They asked us not to post photos of them at the time because the equipment they were carrying might be useful to terror cells planning in future. And so I regard that as totally reasonable, and I don't know anywhere that didn't. So I don't think you saw any pictures of that. That's the level of them most of the time. Said they're about national security. It's totally impossible for it to happen. It's completely fake, which I then wrote up in 10 minutes. 10 minutes work, that's all it would have done. And still, though, that original story stayed up. People shared it for a good 12 hours afterwards. Hundreds of thousands of people saw it. And that really could have contributed to, you know, a real dangerous situation. And so that's sort of where I say technology's weaponized it. I think also we have, for a lot of reasons, we're quite polarized at the moment. You know, Brexit, Remain, sort of internationalism versus the rest of it. I think we actually have an out-of-touch elite. I think Remain tried to run a campaign to a country where real wages, people have got less in their pocket now than they had 10 years ago. It's a country 10 years into a wage freeze where people have had public services cut a long way throughout. And Remain's campaign was essentially, don't ruin the wonderful prosperity you have now. It's like, it's not hard to see why that failed. You don't need Russia to intervene when your campaign message is that bad. And so when you have a real sort of disconnect and a real sense of out of touch and real kind of anger, people can tap into that and misinformation gets a lot more dangerous. And so I think it's that mixture of technological change and that. But of course, there's nothing new under the sun. I think the 1800 presidential race, one of the candidates called the other a hermaphrodite, which every journalist very cheerfully reported.
Yeah. And they say, don't they, that a lie can be halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on. And I think you always see it, even when a story is refuted, and it's the original story is the one that remains in people's minds somehow.
Oh yeah, well, there's always too good to check. Yeah. I think my absolute favourite bit of misinformation, and I really, really can't believe this spread, but quite a lot of people read this, hundreds of thousands, and you still see it going around. And it was essentially a conspiracy theory that Barack Obama had ordered 30,000 guillotines so that when Hillary Clinton won, they could round up supporters of the Second Amendment and take them to a prison camp in Alaska, really convenient location to take people to, that could fit 2 million people. And from this prison camp, using these guillotines, they were going to execute Second Amendment supporters at a rate of 3 million per hour. Now, I'm a numbers guy. I used to run the data blog at The Guardian. I'm not sure what the other million are doing. Are they just sort of voluntarily lining up outside for their appointment slot? But the other thing, I was really impressed by the throughput of the guillotines. Like, that's fast guillotining. But that's the sort of story you can make up in 10 minutes if you've got a much better imagination than mine. It's the opening anecdote of the book, and falsifying that. How do I prove there isn't a secret internment camp in Alaska? So I sort of looked at the biggest building in the world, which turns out to be a Boeing airport factory, airplane assembly thing, and looked at how many people it could hold if you turned it into isolation cells or even general cells. Nowhere near as many. You can see that from any GPS, from space, from all sorts. So it's like you can't have a building or a camp big enough for 2 million people, it doesn't show up. And you would have to block out such a big area from satellite that would show up. That's not there. Someone can say, oh, well, they've hidden it some other way. It's like punching fog. And weirdly, the only bit of the story that had any evidence to it was the purchase order. And there was a purchase order for 30,000 guillotines. Anyone there? It was indeed the paper cuttery things. And so, off one person misreading a purchase order, this sort of... And so that's a public mood thing, a technology thing, and also, when we're all angry, we get in the kind of mood of, we see something here, something here, something here, and join it all up and go, oh my God, there's a massive conspiracy. And that's the mood we're in right now. We're all quite angry. We're all quite paranoid.
I suppose one of the ironies is that we've got more and more sources of information than we've ever had before, and yet people are very selective about the sources of information they use. They use the ones that they agree with, and it's very dangerous, I think. To be moving on to a little bit more positive...
You mean that wasn't cheerful enough for you?
Just think about all those guillotines. Especially the paper guillotines, because they're scary enough on their own, aren't they?
Won't someone think of the trees?
Yeah. At the end of your book, you write that we're all part of the problem, but more positively, that we can also all be part of the solution. What can we do as individuals to help stop the spread of bullshit?
Yeah, so as an individual, I think one of the best things we can all do, we all exist on the internet, we all sort of exist on the stuff, especially before you share something. And I do fail this test often, and I set it. But count to 5 before you share anything. Because just that little count and that pause is, hang on, what's the name of the news outlet again? Is it something I've actually heard of? does this ring true? It just gives your brain a little second to click in and the adrenaline to go out. It's, if anyone's ever read Thinking Fast and Slow, it sort of takes you out of your instinctive thinking and just lets your brain kick in a little bit and go, is this actually true? And that doesn't mean don't share stories that make you angry. It just means think first, and not for very long. Like that honestly would get us a long way to it. And I think the same about believing really anything that we read. Like what we want is to be skeptical, not cynical. The worst thing we can do is give up on trying to tell the truth or trying to encourage other places to do it. You know, that's what Russian misinformation wants. That's what all sorts of things want. You know, skepticism is brilliant, but it so often slides across into, oh, well, you just can't really believe anything you read, can you? We can. Yeah. You know, we know how to. And so I think trying to read smart versions of stuff you disagree with rather than the terrible version, this is sort of really hard. But sort of, you know, I try and read think tank reports from, you know, I am a left-leaning Guardian liberal, you name it, you know. But so I try not to just sort of read the Daily Mail and make myself angry and go, aren't people who don't share my opinions awful? I mean, do that sometimes, but save it for the weekend, you know? I try and find sort of smart, sort of liberal Tories and people like that who often I agree with them on no issues and they don't change my mind, but I at least get a good version of an argument that isn't mine. I try and do a little bit of that. I think diversifying ourselves a bit. I think as well, just trying the more we can to sort of understand positions of, you know, understand the media world we live in and why stuff happens. I think often we excuse the failings of ourselves and our friends and, you know, they were having a bad day, they were having, you know, this, they made a mistake and condemn other sort of intrinsic. And I think actually the more we sort of understand stuff, I think we're in a good position. If we agree on a little shared set of facts, you know, this much is true, we can debate what to do about them. If we don't agree on the basics, if we don't agree what happened in the world today, if we just sort of pretend everything's made up, all we can do is have a shouting match. And so it's just keeping that little bit. It's not a civility thing. It's just having, we have to live in the same reality as each other. And the way the media works at the moment, the way politics works at the moment, it doesn't. You know, try and find a list of 5 facts that an ardent Remainer and an ardent Leaver would agree on. You can maybe get the name of the country. Probably not much further.
Yeah. As you know, everyone here today is a teacher. So, and I know the panel is going to be touching on this a little bit later on, but I wonder what you thought, what role teachers play, teachers in general and perhaps English teachers and media teachers in particular, in the fight against bullshit.
So it's really interesting. I did an hour on Radio 4 just on this, and it was sort of quite interesting for me in that something that I'd been loosely aware of and never thought about was virtually every societal problem. Someone eventually says it should be added to the national curriculum. And so I think at the moment, the sort of 1 hour of PSHE a week is meant to address financial literacy, video game addiction, substance addiction, sex ed, sort of civics and everything else in the world. And so I'm sort of aware anytime you start saying education is a fix, it's this thing of it just means it gets bunged in PSHE. But unfortunately, obviously, it has a role. It clearly does. But the sort of 2 things for me are, anytime you start looking at what people understand when we talk about the world, it's really, really obvious that the way most journalism talks about the world is utterly incomprehensible to everyone. Only about 15% of adults can say what inflation is. And so when we start talking about nominal and real terms, we've already lost someone. Fewer than 1 in 10 can define GDP. Like, by the time we start getting to this sort of really basic stuff, interest rates and all of that stuff, I think we don't actually have a very good understanding of the financial system that we live in. We also have a terrible, terrible understanding of percentages and fractions. And actually, the sort of just try sort of talking to adult, informed adult audiences, people who are buying and reading news, and sort of percentages versus 1 in 6 versus it's really not there. And so, I do wonder the extent to which we could boost teaching of the sort of core concepts. And then the other thing I always tend to sort of lean towards is critical thinking, because it's always the toolkit in going, am I wrong about this? Is this a big number? Is this a trick? Is this a... And I don't think that's having a class once a week called critical thinking. I think it's sort of trying to build more of that in wherever you can. And that's sort of where it comes into English. I remember learning in English language how to analyze a text, how to look at what it's trying to do with you, whether it's using fallacies, that kind of stuff. And, the more of that stuff, the toolkit stuff, I think, does come onto education. But it is hard, and this is not my field. So it's sort of said with the due trepidation of everyone always just eventually goes, well, let's fix it with education, which is usually a way of saying, I don't really want to change what I'm doing, so let's just have schools make it so that what I'm doing works, which would be great, but I recognise it's a cop-out.
Yeah. Okay, I think this might be an appropriate moment to open up the discussion a little bit. So is there anyone who has any questions or comments for James?
Phew. It's always really ominous if hands don't go up.
Yes.
Just curious as to why do you think the media, and I can only speak to the United States, is so reluctant to call it bullshit? To even call it a lie would be pleasant, but they come up with many other words to sort of express that things are false or misleading when it's very clearly bullshit.
Yeah. So this is actually partly why I use the word bullshit. One thing we're really, really bad at in the media is explaining why we do stuff like we do. And so, I think a really good example in the UK and US recently was the Tommy Robinson thing. And this was the kind of former EDL leader who committed a very, very obvious bit of contempt of court and went to prison for it. And Americans aren't aware that in this country you cannot interfere with a trial or report on it in certain ways until it's concluded. And so they're seeing him as a free speech martyr, and we've been very bad at communicating it. I was one of the first journalists on the scene after the Finsbury Park terror attack, and there was already huge anger. It was only about an hour after the attack, but I knew that the suspect was alive, which meant I would be risking messing up his conviction if I called him a terrorist, which was why other journalists weren't, because until the police say he's arrested under the Terrorism Act, and the reason that was different versus, say, the London Bridge attack was that the attackers were dead. And so the media, for about 7 hours, because it took police 7 hours to put out a statement using the word terror, we couldn't use the word, which really fueled anger. I interviewed the 3 people who tackled the attacker. These are guys who'd had to jump out the way of a van an hour before, and they were still angry about the reporting. And because they talked to me, we could run their quote with him saying, I want to kill all Muslims, which at least got a message out. They wanted it to be known what his motive was. But we're not good at communicating that stuff. And so when it comes to why we don't call lies a lie, over here, it's because the burden of proof is on me to demonstrate that someone was knowingly lying. In America, it's much more a weird old convention. And I mean, it's the old impartiality. And, I think a lot of the time, certainly until about 3 or 4 years ago, if the Republican Party had said the earth was flat and Democrats said it was round, they'd run a headline, politics divided over shape of world. They're so down the line by culture. But generally, even though there it's cultural rather than legal, it's because lie implies you know what's going on in their head. I think they're getting better in bullshit, but I think it's happening slowly. What I'm starting to really like is when in headlines they say without basis or untruthfully or falsely. it might not quite be the word we want to see, but it's a lot better than running the claim and then saying in paragraph 4 that it's not true.
Yeah, thank you. Another question? Gentleman over there.
I wanted to ask if you had any suggestions about how we might bring social media critical thinking into the curriculum. What kinds of things might we teach our students about being critical of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and other such social media?
That's really interesting. This will slightly be me thinking aloud. I do apologize, but I think one of the things we have had to learn kind of as an industry, as journalists, is what happens when your story is seen in a very small number of characters. Whether that's, when you see a Guardian article or a Sun article, you see a picture, a headline, and maybe sometimes about 10 words, and whatever's in the tweet. And so there's lots of very good, true stories that when you cut them down in that way, suddenly become either false or misleading. And so the difference often between the lengthy version of a story and what happens if you just read the headline is really interesting. It touches on what I said on the last one of, if you don't put falsely or without basis in the headline, you can write a thoroughly researched takedown of a false statement. But if you're starting it by saying, in a speech on Monday, X said this, and the headline works off that, you can end up spreading the false claim much further. And so working out what happens when you summarize and shape stuff in different ways is really interesting. There's a really interesting video for me on Instagram as well, which was, I think actually it was on YouTube, but it was about Instagram. And it was a girl who's clearly having a really hard and bad day but was sort of working to look like she was having an effortlessly brilliant one on Instagram. And so you see her in sort of accelerated motion, sort of get out of bed, clearly quite miserable, and do a makeup up, like really sort of 4 layers of everything, you name it. And then went back into bed, mirror out, tussling her hair, all of this, to take a bed selfie, smiling. It sort of shows you what happened in the frame and out the frame. And the whole day sort of continues like that. Her food goes cold because she spends so long getting a picture of it that she then doesn't eat any of this delicious meal, and she doesn't. And the sort of in the frame, out the frame, it just really struck me as a proper good conversation starter. I think that kind of stuff, where it comes to images. But on the text stuff, for me, the big effect is what happens with that radical summarization. I can't think of a really good example of one that's gone odd on that, but you see it every day. And the one thing you often notice when you write it now is more than ever, what you have to defend is the headline, which is the one bit that we don't write. And so if someone takes against your piece because of a headline that might be trying to be provocative or trying to set up as if you're arguing one thing when you're arguing another, you then spend the rest of the day with angry people on the internet telling you you're an awful human being in language much saltier than that because of that first bit. And so that would be the other thing, the sort of effect of that.
Thank you. Another question?
You've talked about social media and you've talked about print journalism, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts about the role of broadcast media in kind of propagating untruths. And I mean, obviously, broadcast journalists, in a sense, have a much tougher job of it because they have to deal with interviews with politicians and so on the spot and respond appropriately. And obviously, there's a great deal of anger sometimes about when they don't confront issues.
Yes. One thing I should flag before if I'm going to be somewhat critical of broadcast, they are by far the most trusted bit of it, of the media, especially the BBC, but all broadcasters, much more trusted. The thing that really amuses me is broadcast journalists are the most trusted journalists. Newsreaders are even more trusted than them, which goes to show the public are pretty easily hoodwinked, because who do you think writes the script, guys? And so the person with the nice voice is more trusted than the actual author of it. But I mean, we all trust Moira Stewart, so. Part of it is regulation. You know, they have a requirement by Ofcom to be sort of fair and balanced, essentially. I wish I'd not used the Fox News phrasing there, but and they sort of all interpret that in slightly different ways. You know, Channel 4 News, you have the slightly bizarre thing of they've decided they can have opinion slant online, but not on broadcast, which means it's all turned into slightly nudge-wink, because you'll see an opinion video of Jon Snow on the internet, and then you watch him on All 4 or on the actual TV, and, you know, he's there impartial. It sort of doesn't quite work, and so I think there's a little bit of a mess there. I think it's good to have an agreed set of facts. It clearly works. The BBC is better trusted. I think its instincts lean it towards being biased towards whoever's currently in government. You need to get people on camera. You can't do that by hectoring them. You sort of also, the desire to be impartial means you often just want to let someone get their message out. And sort of if someone's talking, it's quite hard to then just go, that's false, that's false. You feel like that should be for the other party to say. And so getting the right mix of letting people make their own arguments and letting politicians thrash it out and chip in when something's false is really difficult. I don't think they've got the balance right. I think also most people who work in these institutions, though by no means all, lean left. And the BBC trains you so well to try not to go for your own biases that I think people almost do push in the opposite direction. They're sort of so painstakingly trying not to actually bias the news in their own favour. They sometimes produce quite reactionary stuff. I think it's a brilliant institution. It is the most trusted. They're working in a hard environment. I think there's some good lessons we can take from broadcasters and how they're treated, and some cautionary tales.
Yeah, I mean, the BBC gets it in the neck from both sides, doesn't it? I've got friends on the left who are always going on, the BBC is very biased towards the right, but then when occasionally I look at other websites of a more sort of right-wing basis, they're criticising the BBC for being too left-wing.
It's quite
does that mean they're getting it right?
It's quite entertaining to follow Rob Burley on Twitter, if any of you are on there. He edits all of their live programmes, so Mar, Daily Politics, this kind of stuff. And he just constantly spends his life having to try and explain why he's got someone that they don't like booked on a show. And he does it very amusingly. And sometimes I agree with him and sometimes I don't. But it's hard to sort of follow this guy who I've met once in real life for all of 2 minutes and sort of see him as this disingenuous monster trying to sabotage the country one way or another. You know, it's someone trying to put out good, fair programs. Sometimes he manages it, sometimes he doesn't. But I think more of that helps. I think also broadcasters have got really bad at moving with the times. And my sort of general idea is we don't have the same respect for authority that we used to. We won't do something just because a doctor says it's the right thing to do or a minister says it's true. We don't communicate that way anymore. It's not how we're there. And no one believes that BBC journalists sort of appear on the planet age 45 with no views. And so it doesn't look authentic, it doesn't look real, it doesn't represent us. And so they've got to learn how to sound like humans. You know, if anyone listens to Brexit Cast, it's really refreshing to listen to because they kick back and joke a bit. And, you know, Laura Koonsberg in real life has an incredibly wicked sense of humour and is sort of sharp as a tack. And so actually hearing a bit of that and hearing the person, they're a lot harder to turn into the hate figures that they are for some people. They've got to get better at that. They've also got to get more diverse in view and in general stuff. You know, if most of your newsroom is straight, white, middle-class, middle-aged men, and most of them are, they will create good content for straight, white, middle-class, middle-aged men and mediocre content for everyone else. And that shows in trust figures, it shows in all sorts. And, you know, part of the reason that what I regard as a bunch of quite inaccurate, vicious, unpleasant pro-Corbyn blogs happened was because if, right through 2015 until they were created, if you wanted to see stuff that was fair to Corbyn, let alone pro, in the media, it wasn't there. Nowhere did it. And so in that vacuum, something emerged. And that's the fault of the people who left the vacuum, not the fault of the people who then read the new site.
Thanks. One question over here?
Hi, I'm just wondering about your thoughts on the link between fake news and sort of simplified rhetoric. So I'm thinking about whether left or right, an explanation of a story that's been massively or deeply simplified is much more palatable than something that's much more nuanced. I was thinking about your example earlier of the Muslims in Germany and the church, and I was thinking of another one, which was a few years ago in one of the tabloids, where there was a picture of a migrant family in a large house, and then a picture of a pensioner with their, in their council flat, whatever. And that kind of implied a certain causality, which obviously isn't there in reality. But if you're someone that's disenfranchised and you're thinking, where's my money gone? It's much easier to say that person over there took it than understand the nuances of the economic system that's led to you not having any money.
Yeah.
So in terms of how we approach that and how we persuade people to spend more time thinking about the nuances of an argument, how do you think we can approach that?
I think all of those points are really good. I think the political mood, I think getting most things done is quite hard and is quite complicated. And, things you want to work don't. And there's not a whole massive pile of easy wins around. Most stuff that we want to do, most stuff that we want to fix is pretty difficult and requires compromise. And that's not the mood at the moment. People sort of want something big, dramatic, and decisive. And that's not how real change tends to happen. And so how we push back to that mood, I don't really know, because the simplest story always wins. Brexit, one side said, we send the EU 350 million a week, let's give it to the NHS instead. The other side said, well, actually, 350 million a week is quite a misleading figure and they shouldn't be using it because we get a rebate, and the rebate depends on the relative GDP growth of the UK versus the EU 27, but it's usually about 97 million a year, so it'd be much more accurate to use 250 million a week, except we also get structural funds, regional investment funds, Erasmus support, and common agricultural policy, as we all know. So that amounts to about 78 million a week, and so they should be talking about 175 million a week, but that doesn't really reflect the effect on public finances, because if we are on a lower GDP growth trajectory between now and 2030, we'll actually end up with £4,000 less per household in nominal terms at that point, which means that we wouldn't have any extra money each week at all. I'm great fun at parties. It doesn't surprise me which side won that contest. And so I think we have to find ways of telling real stories simply. And I think the left often politically has a desire to educate rather than persuade. And you know what? Persuade first. We might know the real thing's more complex or it's hard, but we need to find good ways of telling, true stories. But it can be a simplification. It can be a one-sentence thing. If we sort of say sometimes getting stuff done is a bit complex and requires compromise, one thing we might have to compromise is on messaging that. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. Lady at the front.
Hi there. My question was linked to the last one about media. I'm a real lover of the BBC, but I must admit, when it's been recently, I've heard it being called as Brexit Broadcasting Corporation, and it has made me think, obviously, because we should be thinking, we should be critical thinkers, but it does make me think that Farage was allowed to be on Question Time a little bit too much. And then, where is the information? I've not heard too much information about the march tomorrow in London. It's not been on the media too much that I've heard. I must admit, I do listen to BBC Radio 4 wall to wall. But also things like the Today programme, that 8:10 slot. Very often, not always, but often it's given to someone, and I just think, oh my God, it's a Brexiteer again. So much as and I do really, really love the BBC, but I just sometimes despair, and I think, what are you doing? Why are you not giving more coverage to the other side?
Yeah. So I mean, as a fully paid up Ramona myself, I often have. It's I'm trying to reclaim it. So I passionately didn't want us to leave. I still don't. I try and cover what's going to happen. All of that. They have quite a difficult situation, and part of it is that the front benches of both major political parties are pro-Brexit. And at the moment, those parties have 82% of the vote at the last election. And so they're obliged to cover sort of the front benches of politics and give certain amount of airtime to those people by party. This is actually what happened with Farage. You have a weird thing with Question Time where the people who've appeared most are frontbench Lib Dems and frontbench UKIPers. And it's because of the fact that until quite recently, every 4 years in European elections, UKIP came first or second, which classes them as a major political party and means UKIP reps need to be on X% of the time. And UKIP then would only offer up Nigel Farage. So while you might have 6 different Labour MPs or 8 different ones on Question Time over a period, you'd have Farage. So he appears a ton. And this happened with the Lib Dems too, because they only had 2 or 3 household names at a time, just to a slightly lesser extent. They're no longer, they quite soon will no longer be a major political party. I think we now sort of see a bit more of Farage than we should. But on the other hand, he was the face of one of the 2 exit campaigns. So it's another one where I said the media is quite bad at communicating some of the rules that we have to live by. They didn't have him on that much because they wanted him there. They really didn't. And they actually didn't have him on in 2017 at all on Question Time. I weirdly happen to know. Why do I know that? I may sometimes share some of the same thoughts as you on the 8:10, but the difficulty for the BBC is, at the moment, the public position of the 2 main parties is to leave. And generally, the test of this one will be tomorrow, and I'll be following this with interest too. There are marches on all sorts of subjects twice a week, 3 times a week. We just as a rule in the media don't really cover them in advance. I would be very surprised if the BBC don't cover it a reasonable amount tomorrow. I don't think they'll lead broadcast with it, but I think it'll be on most stuff. And we'll see.
Thanks, James. We've run out of time, unfortunately, so I'm afraid I was going to ask you about the teacher who had a big influence on you, but...
So I could do you a very quick
Can you give us a quick
version
thing?
of that one. So I didn't study English at university. I apologise unreservedly. I did PPE, which is much worse. But I did get into my university because of my English teacher, actually the head of department. And it was towards the start of 6th form, and I was bright but completely obnoxious, which is why I'm in journalism. But my school sort of tried to get people into Oxbridge. As it happened, I was the only one in my year who did, but every few years it would get one person into one or the other. And so they had a little group of people who were allowed to apply, who got a bit of coaching and, help with the form. And they had no interest in having me in it, and I had no interest in being in it. And my head of department had taught me for the last 2 years. And she sort of took me aside into her office and went, I know you don't want to go. They're all up to themselves, and they think they're so much better than you. And she'd had this rant from me before. She went, I just thinking though, so, if you don't apply, everyone will just say you chickened out. What you really want, surely, is to be able to turn them down, so then no one can suggest to you that you just backed off and you knew you weren't clever enough to do it. which point I immediately make a clamour to go into the Oxford group and got in. So, yes, was very grateful to her. Played me like a fiddle.
Excellent. On that positive note, I think we'll call it a day for today. Thank you.